Okay, so what I want to move on to now is to give you a quick snapshot of pre-modern Judaism. Because in many ways, the Jewish communal experience of this time has some source of roots for us. If you were living in a pre-modern Jewish experience, this is before the Enlightenment, this is before emancipation, this is way before iPhones. We also have to keep our nostalgia in check. People have this nostalgia for the shtetl, thinking that it was, everybody singing and dancing and happy. And there's a reason why tens of millions of people left the shtetl, because it was miserable and poor and backwards and superstitious, and there's reasons why they left. So for all the positives that we might think of in that pre-modern Jewish period, there were also plenty of negatives that caused people to move to the big city and to enjoy it, just like in the Alexandrian period. So I want to look at 5 major areas briefly of this pre-modern Jewish experience. The first is the communal structure. We have to realize that the concept of individual citizenship didn't exist back then. Your rights were a collective right based on the class you belonged to. You could have been a burgher, B-U-R-G-H-E-R, living in the city. You could have been a merchant. You could have been a peasant, not a lot of rights for peasants. You could have been a serf, even fewer rights for the serfs. Or you could have been a Jew. And that was a class of people that had collective rights. The Jewish community would negotiate their right of residence, of commerce, of trade, of ability to be present, and mobility within a particular territory. And it could be that a new king or duke would come into power and had to renegotiate the deal. And if you couldn't come to terms and agreement, the Jews had to leave, because all of them had to leave. It was a collective identity. Now what that produced was a sense of ethnic solidarity, but also an internal governance structure. You see, the bureaucracy didn't want to collect taxes directly. They would say, the Jewish community, you pay us X amount for this right to live here, or you do your own census. But that means the Jews themselves had their own right of taxation internally, and their own sense of individual self-governance. The name for their self-governing body was often called a kehillah, which means community. They were elected from the rich people, and men, of course, again, these pre-modern times. In Yiddish, there's a nice word for these people. They're called the machers. These are like the movers and the shakers. So I call this period of history where it was ruled by the machers, democracy. The machers are the ones that are running everything. And sometimes they acted for the good of the community. For example, they would appoint someone called the shtadlan, or the intercessor, who would negotiate with the duke or the king for the Jewish right of residence or to avoid pogroms. They had communal funds that would support the poor and the indigent. They had a chevra for chevra is sort of a self-service agency, social service agency. They had a chevra for providing dowries to orphan brides so they could get married. They had a chevra to ransom captives if they were taken captive trading across the Mediterranean. In fact, it saved Jewish lives because pirates would not kill the Jews. They knew they could get money for them at the port, whereas others were at much greater risk. And there was most famously the Chevra Kadisha, which is the social service agency in charge of taking care of the dead and burying them. These were all provided from communal funds. Now, how did they get those communal funds? Unfortunately, they made taxes that benefited them. So they would have a flat tax. They would tax Shabbat candles. They would tax kosher chickens, which you had to have a meat meal on Shabbat. You had to have Shabbat candles, so everyone is taxed equally. It's what's called a flat tax, or even a regressive tax, because we know it's more expensive for people who earn less to pay the same amount than for people who earn more to pay the same amount. So again, when you get the rich people making the tax laws, surprise, we have some familiarity with that dynamic more recently as well. But that was the Jewish communal experience. It was these collective rights, living as a group and having rights based on the group. But if you were, for example, expelled from the group, if you had a cherem or excommunication enacted on you, you were in real trouble because you no longer had any right to live there. Again, no individual citizenship. If you're not in this group, you have to be in something else. And often, excommunication was a very powerful tool to enforce Jewish conformity, because it would not only cut you off from your family and your friends and your business context, but from your very right to live in the territory where you were living. saw a hand question.
So you mentioned they collected the taxes on behalf of the authority. Did that also apply? I mean, the government, the surrounding government being at one remove, did that apply to the enforcement of laws as well?
In many cases, yes.
Okay.
And there were often two different court systems. The Jews had their own court system, and then there was the secular, it wasn't really secular at the time, but there was the broader court system, and it was often considered to be a shanda or a scandal if a Jew went to the non-Jewish court system to try to get justice. He wanted to do it internally. And these still offer today, these still are operative today in certain parts of New York and other states. The Beit Din, or a house of justice, or a rabbinic court, is accepted as a valid arbitration setting. And the same is true for Sharia courts in Canada, and there's some discussion of other places as well. Obviously, the witness laws are different. The status of women is different in those courts. We would have objections to a lot of the procedures involved. But for Jews at this time, the right to be able to judge by Jewish law and have their own courts make these decisions, as opposed to going to a court run by a priest, felt to be a real advantage. Yes.
Does shanda mean scandal?
Yeah. Or shame.
Oh, that's interesting. Shanda rhymes.
Spelled differently and different ethnicity. Yes.
So I know that in the state of Israel currently there are rabbinic courts, and that a large proportion of a proportion of the population abides by them, and they claim at times the right to ignore the secular laws.
Right, and in particular it's problematic with issues of personal status, marriage, divorce, and so on, where you're required to go through the rabbinical court. If you have a damages issue or a contract issue, you can go to either one, in theory, but for marriage laws, you're required to go to the rabbinic courts, and that's really a problem for more secular people. Yes?
Yeah. When you started off saying that there were not individual rights, but sort of communal rights, and you gave the examples of the burghers, the merchants, the serfs, the peasants, and then the Jews. But the other examples you gave were all kind of broad economic classes, whereas the Jews, it seemed like across the spectrum of economic class within the Jewish community, that was considered a class.
Well, keep in mind at this time there are no Jewish lawyers. This is the period in history before Jewish lawyers, because guess what the law courts are? They're all Catholic courts. They're all under canon law, under Catholic law. There are no Jewish doctors. And the broader population, there are some Jewish doctors internally to the Jews, but medical schools are run through universities. And guess what? Universities are all Catholic universities. It isn't until, I think, the 1500s that a Jew goes to the University of Venice for the medical school, and he's able to do it because there's a bit of a secularization pre-Renaissance opening up there. Maimonides famously is a court physician in the Middle East, in the Arabic world, but in Christian Europe it was much less of a possibility.
Well, so there wasn't a broad economic range, but still it would seem like that's a different situation where you have that. So were the Jews unique in being separated as a cultural or
that's a good point to make.
Versus other groups that were
right? I mean, all the other groups around them, remember, there's no pagans anymore. They've been wiped out. There's no Lutherans yet. Again, I know it's heresy in Minnesota, but there were no Lutherans around yet. I mean, there was just it wasn't even called the Catholic Church. It was called the Church. That's all there was. So they were the only religious minority floating around. And so they had certain rights of residence, but also rights of living poorly. St. Augustine, who wrote in the, I think, 4th century of the Common Era, came up with this idea that the Jews can stick around, but they have to be a witness to what happens when you reject Christ. So you have to keep them in a position where they're not too successful, not too comfortable, not too showy. They have to be in a somewhat oppressed position. So they're tolerated, but with severe limitations and occasional actions against them. And that's where, and we have to remember as well that Jews often did fit a particular economic niche. I'll give you 2 examples. In Eastern Europe, Jews were not tied to the land. The serfs were tied to the land. So Jews would often serve as merchants between the cities and the peasants because they weren't tied to the land. And they would take the grain the peasants made and process it into liquor. So Jews often ran taverns, and they would buy the right to run taverns in a particular area. The Jews would bring processed goods from the cities back to the peasantry and vice versa. So they were the middlemen running between town and countryside. The other example that they served was in the area of money lending. We don't think about Jews and money without getting a little nervous about that conversation. But in fact, because both Christians and Jews read a passage in the Bible that says you will not lend an interest to your brother, to mean that Jews could not lend an interest to Jews, and Christians could not lend an interest to Christians, they both agreed that Jews could lend an interest to Christians. And if you want a commercial economy, and you see an economic opportunity, you need cash to be able to do it. And no one's going to give you their cash. They're going to let you use their cash as long as you pay them for the right to use their cash. It's called interest. Now the question of what usury is, that's a judgment call. Usury is too much interest, but that's, again, a subjective determination. But the fact that Jews were able to lend at interest gave them an advantage over non-Jewish bankers who simply weren't able to function in that way. They served as bankers until a non-Jewish banking population developed, so they had that economic niche. And the other example that Jews were different, and some Jews were craftsmen, peddlers, like everybody else around them, but Jews were also able to serve as merchants in between the Muslim world and the Christian world, because they were neither. For a Christian to go from Italy to Egypt would have been very problematic. For a Muslim to go from Syria to Italy would have been difficult. But for Jews to go between the two, they had some advantages. They were neither religion. They had that ransom from the pirates fund, waiting in case they got caught. And they had a common code of laws that they could use to enforce contracts with their Jewish contacts on the other end of the trading ring, because they were all functioning under Torah and Talmud law. So the fact that they had a common set of laws, they had international contacts, they had the facility to go between countries because they weren't either warring party, that opened up opportunities for merchants. And when you get enough money as a merchant, you stop traveling and you become a banker. And that, again, it's a minority of the Jewish community that did this, but it was an important part of the Jewish economic profile.
So for the taxation, like the self-taxation that the Jews had on themselves for the Shevra funds, they were also taxed by the kingdoms or the...
Yes, they had to pay a tax to the general kingdom, but again, it was sort of a group tax. It wasn't as if the king said, okay, you individually, you pay this and this and this, and he sends a taxman out to go. You would actually just pay a group tax. And sometimes in Eastern Europe, Jews served as what were called tax farmers. Doesn't mean you plant tax and grow them. Tax farmer means you buy the right to collect taxes in a certain area. Sort of like private companies that buy the right to collect tolls on a road or a bridge. The Skyway in Chicago, they sold the concessions for the toll roads as a private company who then jacked up the price, which is how it goes. Well, the same was true in Eastern Europe. The Jews would buy the right to collect taxes for a particular area. And what that means is the person that the farmers see collecting taxes is the Jewish person. But the landowner gets his money up front in a lump sum. And in theory, the Jew is able to make money in the difference between what they paid the landowner and what they're collecting from the people. But when there's a revolt or there's an objection to the landowner, guess who gets the brunt of the violence? Unfortunately, it was the Jews. So we talked about economics. The one last thing I wanted to point out with regard to the Jewish economic profile is that Jews were very urban. They tended not to live in farms in rural areas. Part of that was no one aspired to be a serf. They didn't want voluntarily to be a peasant. But the second was that there was protection in numbers, that being in a farm in an isolated setting was somewhat dangerous for Jews. And the third is that going back to the 2nd century before the Common Era, when Jews began to move to Alexandria, they were attracted by the big city, urban professions, multicultural settings that you find in a city. And so Jews tended to be urban even back in the Middle Ages.
Would it be fair to say at this point that Jews stood out because they were cosmopolitan?
It's a little early for that.
That's a little early.
It's a little early.
But are we talking about a precursor?
Well, right.
Yeah.
So cosmopolitan means literally universal city, cosmos and polis. And so a cosmopolitan is someone who is a citizen of the world. It's a little early for that. Mm-hmm. Jews were still living in Jewish neighborhoods. By the way, sometimes those ghettos had the locks on the inside. Because the Jews would come in and they would lock the door because they didn't want people to get in. So it was a self-segregation as well. And you wouldn't call someone who's voluntarily living in a ghetto and following Jewish dietary laws and observing the laws of Jewish ritual purity and so on, and not eating at their neighbor's house and dressing differently. And you wouldn't really call that person a cosmopolitan. They're urban, but it's not quite the same.
Okay, so where does it enter where I've always been led to understand that it was illegal for Jews to own land?
Well, that's also part of it. In certain parts of the world it was. In other parts, they just didn't want to.
Okay, and that would have included farming and...
Right, that would have included farming. But again, remember in most of the parts of Europe, it was a feudal system. And so the lords owned the land. The peasants didn't own the land either. They worked the land, but they didn't own the land. So, again, our dynamic of open economy where anybody can buy land is not quite how it applied in that period. Okay, a third feature of Jewish life in this time is what's called halakha. Halakha is the Hebrew word for the law. Literally, it means walking. The word halakha is to walk. And it's similar, by the way, to Islamic law. Sharia means the path, or in Taoism, the Tao is the path that one walks. And it defines all of life. It's all-encompassing. It includes obligations between people, laws, contracts, morals, ethics, gossip, but it also includes obligations to the God. Ritual purity laws, prayer, fasting, observance. So if you call it religious law, it doesn't fit into the category of religious behavior as we think of. It's religious law in the sense that its authority comes from the religion, but it applies to everything. So these Beit Din, or Batei Din that we talked about, these Jewish law courts, would enforce law on contracts and on paying workers and on divorce law, as well as they would enforce laws of ritual purity and are you lighting your Shabbat candles and so on. In fact, the rabbi originally in this period was not primarily a pastoral counselor, public speaker, community leader. When a rabbi was ordained, they would ask two questions. Yoreh, can he teach? Yoreh, he can teach. Yadin, can he judge? Yadin, he can judge. He was a dayan, he was a judge of Jewish law. And you would have a rabbi in a particular town who was the legal authority for that town. You have a question, you go to the rabbi. If he had a problem, or there was a circumstance he couldn't resolve, he would go to his teacher, or the higher court, so to speak, and ask a question. And if that person didn't have the answer, he would go back to the Rabbinical Training Academy where he was trained and ask the heads of the academy there, and they might write a response. In fact, a whole literature developed called responsa literature, which is sort of like what we would call frequently asked questions. Someone has an issue, they write up a detailed response, and then publish that response in case other communities have a similar kind of question. So that kind of literature was one way that Jewish law was developed. There was a core textbook of Jewish law. It wasn't the Torah. The Torah was sort of like the Constitution. But you don't find out what the law is by reading the Constitution. You have to read the commentaries on the Constitution, what we call Supreme Court decisions. And so the core of rabbinic law is a book called the Talmud, which developed in a couple of different layers. First, there was a book called the Mishnah, which collected rabbinic sayings from 200 BC to 200 CE. And then there were further commentaries on that ultimately get put together into the Talmud by around the year 600 of the Common Era. And the Talmud would define what Jewish law should be, except it preserves discussion. It's not always clear unless you know the text well what the actual answer is. And often they're trying to harmonize two perspectives to give them both some credibility. Remember the story last night of the walls that were collapsing, but they wound up crooked because they wanted to honor both rabbis and not choose one side or the other? One example of a halachic discussion. Which shoe should you put on first? The right shoe or the left shoe? Well, one rabbi says the right shoe, then the left, so this is the left and the right. How do they solve this dilemma? You put on the left and the right, but you tie the right and the left. This, by the way, is also the reasoning behind the lighting of Hanukkah candles. There was a debate over do you light it from right to left or left to right? And the solution is you put them in one way and you light it the other way. So they find a way again to harmonize both sides. Yes?
So were there people living at that time who were like, I don't care, I'm going to do what I want? Or was everyone really interested in, I need to know the rules to every single thing that I do?
Neither.
Oh, okay.
People were not able to make that choice. You live in, I mean, do you think Catholics were running around saying, I don't know if I believe in this transubstantiation thing? They were, I mean, literacy was limited, and the ability to question was limited. And what would you do if you decided you didn't want to do it? I mean, where do you go? There's no university town that you can escape to. It's an oasis of rationale. I mean, there's no place to go. So, again, the kind of questions generally weren't asked, or if they were suppressed. I mean, there are episodes of people asking questions like that, or not believing in the canons. They're the ones burned. They're the ones rejected. I mean, there was a character in around the 9th century of the Common Era named Piwi al-Balkhi, from a town called Balkh in Central Asia, who wrote a whole series of questions about the Bible. How could this be true? How could that be true? We don't have his book. We don't know anything about him except for the fact that Saadia Gaon, a Jewish philosopher and the head of a rabbinic academy, wrote a rebuttal of Chiwi's work. So we know what Chiwi said only because of the rebuttal that survived. Who knows what happened to Chiwi? So, you know, that kind of autonomy of asking questions is something we're used to now. It was both Christians and Jews believed that Moses got the Torah on Sinai. Everybody believed the world was 6,000 years old. You know, there's not the kind of dialogue and marketplace of ideas we think of today. I'll give you one other example. One of the anti-Semitic accusations against Jews made in the Middle Ages was called the host desecration. They would steal the communion wafer and they would torture it with knives. And you see these woodcuts by very famous artists that show these evil, sinister Jews stealing the wafer, taking it, and stabbing it with a knife with a big drop of blood coming out of the wafer. Now, from a modern sensibility, this is crazy. Why would you believe the Jews would believe this? It's not about belief or not belief. It's about what was true. From a Catholic perspective, for someone who was living in a Catholic, it is true. This is the body. Even Jews know it. They're just wicked because they reject it. And so if they're going to act on their wickedness, they're going to take it and torture it, just like they tortured him the last time. And that's what the basis of the accusation. So for us, it makes no sense at all. But in that time period, the beliefs of your system were the truth. And that's how you live.
When and how was it decided to freeze the Talmud? Why are there not further commentaries?
Well, the answer is there are further commentaries. If you look at a Talmud page, there's the Mishnah text, you'll have what's called the Gemara or the Talmud text, and then on the sides you'll have other commentaries that have been added over the centuries. Rashi wrote a commentary, Maimonides has a commentary, and so on. So there are other commentaries, but they're written on the side so you don't confuse it with the main text. At a certain point, they consolidate the main text. And that would be a great topic for a future seminar.
Okay, because nobody now makes those commentaries, right?
No, but people are still making these commentaries.
But they're not
still
writing
making law rules, but it's not necessarily added to the edition. That's right.
And there's 2 Talmuds.
There's also 2 Talmuds, again, beyond the purview of what we're going to get into. There's a less authoritative Talmud from the land of Israel and a more authoritative Talmud from Babylonia. When people say the Talmud, they generally refer to the Babylonian Talmud.
Oh, I feel like I'm getting hung up. But I'm just wondering about like the minutia of how can people make any decisions, or do they feel like, okay, God told me to wear brown, so I'm going to wear brown, or like was there any room for any type of personal decision during the day, or was like everything prescribed?
Of course there were, but you know, when it came to eating, there were certain texts you had to say when you ate. When it came to during the Passover week, you didn't have the choice of whether or not to get rid of all your chametz. You had to have only matzah and unleavened bread. There were many areas where you didn't have choice. And the other piece to keep in mind is that while there was room for individual expression, the perspective was, this gets into the theology, God gave you a manual with everything you need to do for eternal salvation in this resurrection, the world to come, and for happiness in this life. Plus, He's your dad. You know, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. Don't you want to obey, honor and respect your cosmic parent? Wouldn't you want to know every detail of how to do every law? If you got the manual for life, wouldn't you read it again and again and get an expert teacher who can tell you exactly what it means in every sub-detail? And so that's why the ideal in this culture was not the lawyer or the doctor. It was the scholar who had studied and studied and studied the text even more. Remember in Fiddler on the Roof, it's not a great historical source, but when he's singing If I Were a Rich Man, what is the pinnacle, the sweetest thing of all, if he's a rich man? To have the time to go in the synagogue and study and pray. That for him was the ideal. Because this is the divine revelation and you want to know as much as possible what exactly what to do.
But I think to some extent, to your point, Sarah, like I think everything you're saying is correct, but the level of sort of intense observance that we associate with Orthodox Jews today wasn't possible in that earlier time, just in terms of I don't know, you couldn't, chemically analyze this food and determine that there weren't, 0.3%, trace particles of whatever that was unkosher, or you can't gauge the sun, set exactly at 6:07, and therefore you did this at 6:08, and you're not.
And there has been an enlightenment and a rejection of rabbinic tradition that produced the fanatic response. Mm-hmm. You didn't call yourself Orthodox back then, just like the Catholic Church was just the church, it was just Judaism. The Orthodox movement starts in the 19th century in response to the Reform movement. Mm-hmm. In fact, the word Orthodox means correct doctrine, ortho like orthopedic, and dox is in doctrine. The idea of an Orthodox Judaism that asserts we are the right version requires other versions. Mm-hmm. So before there are other versions, there's just a sense this is who we are. And by the way, periodically there are rabbis who write letters in response to complaining about how lax people are. They're cutting Shabbat early, and they're drinking non-Jewish wine, and they're complaining about people being less strict on the observance. And as Eva points out correctly, the fanatical version of Ashkenazi, ultra-Orthodoxy, that's a much more recent innovation. It wasn't the case in the Middle Ages.
Did they say much about women then, and women raising children, and just the home life?
Well, they talk a lot about what women are expected to do. There's a whole section of the Mishnah, like a sixth of the Talmud, is called women, because of course that's the special case. It's extra attention. Women were not taught to read and study in the same way that men were. There is a story that Rashi's daughters, because he only had daughters, did put on tefillin and did do some of the things that classically were reserved for men. But in general, women were thought to be of a second order of status. That goes back to when the temple stood in Jerusalem. There was a court for the non-Jews. They could only go up to a certain point. Then there was the court of the women, who could go up to a certain point. Then there was the court for all the Jewish men, and then there was a court for the Levites. But the women were, again, at a lower order. Jews are like everybody else. The Gloria Steinem also you cannot find in the 1500s. Now, in terms of the social history of what was it like to raise children, and then there are texts that speak to this. And this is, again, a recent innovation in historiography. In general European studies, people didn't talk about what women did and what food was like. So this has been a revolution in Jewish studies as well. There's one resource that's been invaluable for that. In Cairo, in Old Cairo, it was called Fustat, there was a synagogue that had a room in the back called a Ganesha, which is a place where you put holy books that are decomposing and you can't use them anymore, but you have to bury them in a cemetery. What happened in the Cairo Jewish community was they had this room for a Ganesha, and they were taking the books out to bury them, and there was a pogrom or a riot against them because they were being too noisy or public in their demonstration. So they stopped taking it to the cemetery and just kept collecting and collecting. And then the community began to include anything written in Hebrew in there, not just things with God's name on it, which is the traditional category. So now you get ketubas, you get letters to each other, you get contracts. Often they would write on the back of another piece of paper, so you get a letter on one side and an inventory sheet on the other side for the shipment that just came in from India. I mean, this is a tremendous treasure trove of daily life, commerce, average people interactions, not what the rabbis are writing about. So that kind of resource is invaluable. There aren't a lot of those, but the fact that we found it is really fantastic. And so we have some of that social history coming out now, but it's much less presented historically. Yes?
I can't think of the title offhand, but two poets have written a history of that Ganesha and how it was discovered. I'll give you the reference.
And what year are we in now with this?
Well, the Ganesha begins around the year, I want to say 1200, 1300. We actually have, for example, examples of Maimonides' handwriting coming out of the Ganesha because he was in the Egyptian Jewish community. and carrying on into the 19th century. It was discovered at the end of the 19th and 20th century. Okay, so you have the Talmud, which is the law book, but also includes all these legal discussions. And, reading a Supreme Court decision might not help you decide what's legal or not. So eventually there are law codes that are made that list specifically, here's what you do, and here's the order you do it, and this is the answer. Now, in terms of the theological background to Jewish life in the Middle Ages, they clearly believe in the chosen people, that they are an elect, and that's one of their reasons for continuing to be Jewish despite all the suffering that they're enduring. They believe in what I call rabbinic anachronism, that is the belief that the way things are now is the way they always have been. Abraham ate matzah. Now, if you think about the chronology of the Bible, it doesn't make sense that Abraham would eat matzah. But when it was spring, good Jews eat matzah. So of course, he might not have known why he was doing it, but he got rid of the chametz and he had his matzah. You can see this as well in medieval Haggadot for Passover that were illuminated manuscripts where they drew illustrations to describe the story in the book, just like you have Christian illuminated manuscripts. Same thing for these medieval Haggadot with drawings and beautiful decorations. But they often depict Moses in medieval garb. The city of Pharaoh looks like Padua. I mean, they're presenting what is as what always was. And so there isn't a sense of evolution, of change over time. There's a sense that it's always been the way that we want it to be.
Did they realize that what they were doing, that anachronism?
I am not a trans-time psychologist.
I mean, there's no evidence that they had some clue that this was ridiculous?
Talk to a 10-year-old about life before smartphones. Talk to a 20-year-old about life before email. Talk to a 40-year-old about life before television. I mean, we are simply used to what we're used to, and we assume it's always been that way. It's a very human phenomenon to imagine that we've always had digital watches, we've always had cars, we've always had airplanes. Mm-hmm. And to imagine a world without it is very hard.
But that Moses ate matzah is just so ridiculous.
Keep in mind, the perspective is that we are living in a degeneration. It's like a devolution. Mm-hmm. So the earliest generation didn't even need the laws written down. They just lived it right. And then a later generation, they needed to write down the law so they would follow it exactly. And then there was an oral Torah, a commentary to that written law, the Torah, that helped explain the details. But then, of course, we got worse, and we couldn't even remember the oral law passed down word to mouth, so we had to write down the oral law. That's the Talmud. And so there's a sense that the earlier generations were doing it exactly right, and we just must be going down, and we're doing our best to keep it. That's why there's an inflexibility, an unchangeability. You have to be stricter and stricter as opposed to being more lenient or evolving, because we're trying to keep it, preserve it as much as possible. And that's why by the 16th century, the ultra-Orthodox world froze the clothing and said, black hat, black clothes, that's it. Even though that was modeled on Polish nobility at the time. You can see pictures of these Polish nobles from the 1500s looking like Orthodox Jews without the payas. But otherwise, they're dressed that same way. They said no change, because any change could lead to too much change.
Were Jews allowed to convert to Christianity?
Yes. Jews could convert out. It happened plenty of times. It was very rare for Christians to convert in, because why would you ask for that? In the Muslim world, it was an interesting complication, because Christians could convert to Judaism, and the Jews could convert to Christianity. A Jew could convert to Islam, but a Muslim could not convert out. There was no apostasy is the word. And by the way, even today, in many Muslim countries, apostasy, converting out of Islam, is a capital crime. There's a reason they're killing Christians in Afghanistan and Pakistan and other countries.
Christians, I believe, were forbidden to convert to Judaism, and Jews were forbidden to try to convert Christians.
Yes, there were limits on it. But there were episodes of Christians converting to Judaism. It's just very rare, and as you say, in many cases, banned by law. Yes?
An analogy to what you said about the illuminated manuscripts, having them dressed like Italians, is Shakespeare's plays about the Greeks had them dressed like the way Shakespeare's era dressed.
Right, exactly.
It would be helpful if people could talk louder.
Okay.
And, really, because we can't hear that.
Yes, I will reemphasize that. Speak louder, yes.
Yeah, sort of following from Janet's question, I mean, it's entirely natural for us to say, this doesn't make any sense. And you just before that, you had mentioned that the rabbis studied and studied and studied, but there was no applying of the test of reason to the sacred text that they studied.
Sure, they had a principle of reason, but it was reason in the category of religious law and practice. So you could make an argument for why such and such would be kosher or such and such would not be kosher.
Okay.
That's using your logic to explain. But to challenge the idea of kosher laws, that was beyond the pale. That you could do. And they would admit sometimes, one of the sayings in the Talmud is, some laws are like a mountain hanging by a hair. Imagine there's one little connection to the text, and all these laws, like the kosher laws from do not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, and 2 dishes, and how long you have to wait after eating one to eat the other, and all these are the mountain hanging by a hair. They'll admit it, but they still believe that it's old and traditional, and sometimes they'll say, this is that anachronism. If they can't even find a proof text, they'll say, it's a halakha leMoshe miSinai. It's a law from Moses on Sinai. That means we've been doing it forever, and we've always been doing it that way, and by gum, we're going to keep it that way. That's why I try to make the point to humanistic Jewish congregations, we of all Jews should not say if someone brings in a new melody or a new text, well, this is the way we've always done it. We can't change anything. Well, we've changed everything else, so we have to be a little bit more flexible. Okay, and I included in the packet, we're not going to have time to look at it now, Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith. Maimonides is sort of living in both sides of this world. He's living exposed to Greek culture through Arabic translation, reading philosophy. He's a court physician to the non-Jewish court in Cairo. He's also the head of the Jewish community and the chief rabbinic sage of his era. So on one hand, he writes a book of Jewish philosophy called The Guide for the Perplexed, which is trying to explain again why he believes what he believes in philosophic categories. But he writes it in Judeo-Arabic. It's Arabic written in Hebrew letters. So it's not for the Arabic audience, because they can read the Hebrew letters, and it's not for the average, even Jewish literate audience, who can read Hebrew but can't read Judeo-Arabic. And it's so controversial, by the way, that in some parts of the Jewish world, they burn Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. Now, on the other hand, he's also a Jewish religious authority. He writes a book called the Mishnah Torah. It's his code of laws, where he lists what you do on Passover, how to be ethical. All of that halakha he's tried to distill into one code book. And in that book, he writes what he calls the 13 Principles of Faith, also referred to as Ani Ma'amin, I believe, because each one of them begins, Ani Ma'amin be'emunah shlema, I believe with perfect faith. And this is, if anybody asks you, does Judaism have a creed, things you have to believe? This is one example. And this is recited as part of the daily weekday service in an Orthodox congregation. So don't let anyone tell you, oh, Judaism is just about deed and not creed. It's just about what you do and commandments and not about beliefs. BS. There are plenty of texts that you can point to that say Jews are expected to believe A, B, and C from an Orthodox perspective. Here's one of them. He believes the Creator made everything. He believes the Creator is not physical. He believes the Creator is the first and the last. It's only allowed to pray to the Creator. No saints, no Jesus, no other people. I believe with complete faith all the words of the prophets are true. The entire Torah in our hands is the same as was given to Moses. And a whole series of doctrinaire, dogmatic beliefs that he's telling you to believe. And if you want a summary of Orthodox theology, Maimonides is a good example. By the way, I scored 0 for 13 on this. And the last aspect of this medieval Jewish experience is relations with the outside world. There were times that relations with the outside world were bad. Crusades, bad. Living as an oppressed minority under the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe, or the Catholic Church in Poland, bad. Being expelled during the Black Death and other periods of persecution, being blamed for poisoning wells and desecrating the host, and all these other accusations, bad. Disputations where Jews were forced to argue in front of crowds for their right to live there, but also for their right to exist. And often it was Jewish converts to Christianity that were the ones doing the interrogating on the other side, saying, well, what about the Talmud where it says this, this, and this? And they have to argue back and forth. It's a very skewed debate. was no independent judges there. So there were certainly times of fear and persecution. Remember, the Jews are the quintessential foreigners in most parts of the Christian world. At the same time, there are periods of stability. Jews live in Krakow from the 1400s all the way through the Nazi persecution. Jews live in the Muslim world for many centuries as a subordinate minority. They have to pay an extra tax, they have limitations of what they can do publicly with their religion, but they're able to live comfortably, economically, successfully for many centuries. As a subordinate minority. They can't get too uppity. But as long as they don't get uppity, they can continue to exist and even prosper. And often there are fruitful interactions between Muslim culture and Jewish culture. One example is what took place in Muslim Spain in what's called the Golden Era, 1200, 1300, early 1400s, of the experience of Jewish life in Spain. Before the Inquisition takes over, before the Reconquista takes over, Jews are able to interact with Muslims and Christians, and often are informed by non-Jewish culture. There's a whole body of Jewish poetry that's written in this time period that reflects Arabic models and Arabic themes. Some of it is pious poetry, praising God, imagining biblical figures and new stories, but a lot of it is focused on what we would call secular things, this world, this life, wine. There's a famous book called Wine, Women, and Death. It's an anthology of Spanish Jewish poetry. So I brought in the packet a few examples of this kind of material. Yehuda Halevi is one of the preeminent figures of this period. He writes both secular poetry and pious poetry. The famous one is the one on the bottom right of his section, My Heart is in the East, where he says, my heart is in the East and I am in the depths of the West. I would long to be in Israel, he says, but I'm here all the way in Spain on the other end of the world from his perspective. My food has no taste. How can it be sweet? How can I fulfill my pledges and my vows? This is Nidrai Va'asarai, like from the Kol Nidrei prayer. How can I fulfill my pledges and my vows when Zion is in the power of Edom and I in the fetters of Arabia? It will be nothing for me to leave all the goodness of Spain. So rich will it be to see the dust of the ruined sanctuary. You could only see even the ruins of Jerusalem. It would be better. So there's a very pious message there, right? But then look at the poem right above it, called The Gray Hair. One day I observed a gray hair in my head. I plucked it right out when it thus said to me, you may smile if you wish at your treatment of me, but a score of my friends soon will make a mockery of you. That's life, right?
It seems like a theme, and maybe you can comment on it. You were saying before, follow the laws, follow the rules, get persecuted, but you'll have favor somewhere else some future time. Assimilate, and things get better. And that poem underlines it for me. I like poetry, and I was reading these poems to some non-Jewish friends, and they said, oh, that's just like any old Spanish poem where you're talking about the essence of beauty and beauty going away. Mm-hmm. So this is a Jewish poem that you wouldn't know is from someone who's Jewish in Spain. Is that true at this point in pre-modern Judaism? Is the more the Jews who assimilated to the culture around them, just like now, I suppose, were tolerated as that subordinate minority, the more you settled yourself, the more you're going to be persecuted? Well,
in theory, if you could eat your neighbor's house, they're more likely to do business with you.
Yeah.
And there were Jews who were more insular, who may have been less successful in that regard. But it was a temporary phenomenon. I mean, the challenge with medieval Spain is with the Reconquista, there's a desire to purify Spain and to eliminate both Muslims and Jews to get them out of the kingdom.
No matter how normalized you were.
No matter how, right, it didn't matter. As long as you were still different, there was a problem. And in fact, even if you converted, it didn't necessarily save you, because the Inquisition, Mel Brooks got it wrong. He said, we started the Inquisition to get rid of the Jews. The Inquisition didn't target self-admitted Jews. It targeted people who converted and then maintained a kind of secret Jewish practice. So if you were a self-admitted Jew, the Inquisition didn't talk to you. But if you were a converso, someone who converted, we don't use the word morano anymore because it means like a pig and it's kind of an insult. But if you were a converso, someone who converted but secretly maintained Jewish practice, then you were targeted. And there even began to be enacted a principle in Spain called the belleza de sangre, which means purity of the blood. They would ask, are you an old Christian or a new Christian? And if you were a new Christian, you were more suspect. And you had to show your pedigree to be able to rise in the church or in the bureaucracy and so on. So that's almost the origins of a kind of racialist anti-Semitism where even if you converted, it wasn't a solution. So there was a limit to how far assimilating could work in your favor. And again, you had to be careful, because if the Jewish community expelled you, you had other challenges that came out of it. So you could push the envelope a bit, but only as long as you had enough people with you that you weren't going to be expelled as an individual. So there were other examples of fruitful Jewish interaction with the surrounding culture. The Ottoman Empire was one. The Renaissance is another, where Jews become the translators who take it from Arabic back into Greek and Latin, who teach Hebrew to Christian scholars who want to learn the original sources. They really open doors in between cultures, and that's their niche in European intellectual life. So this is the snapshot of the medieval Jewish period. The last piece I want to look at before we take a short break is the question of Baruch Spinoza. And I'll just point you to, there's a piece by Emmanuel of Rome on page 8. It's a great example of the Renaissance era freedom that Jews had to write even heretical texts, where Emmanuel in the first poem decides to spurn the Garden of Eden in favor of hell, because that's where he finds all the lustful ladies. All you want is the pious, pure people who go to heaven, but what you want is something else. You've got to look where they go. And again, this is something impossible to conceive of a century or two before, when the Jewish community had strict authority. As things become looser, now it becomes a little bit more possible. And so Spinoza, paradoxically, is sort of a snapback of the traditionalist perspective, where they're beginning to lose control. People are acting more and more secular. These converso Jews, who have lived for a century even under Christian rule, and finally are able to come out of the closet, so to speak, as Jews in Amsterdam or in the Ottoman Empire, as they managed to escape Portugal and Spain, they've been trained to be questioning of religious authority. Their kids would go to school, and their parents would say, don't believe everything the priest tells you. Well, if you've learned not to believe everything the clergy tells you, and then you show up in a Jewish community, maybe you still don't believe everything the clergy tells you. You've read the Bible without the rabbinic commentaries. So you say, what is this milk and meat garbage you're trying to sell me? There's nothing about that anywhere in the Torah. What are you talking about? You've gone to universities, because remember, they're Catholic universities, but if you're officially Catholic, you can go to university, and you become exposed to philosophy and the broader knowledge that's out there, and you maybe believe there is truth outside of the Jewish canon. So that lifestyle of being skeptical and questioning shows up in more than just Spinoza. There's a man named Juan del Prado who also leads the Jewish community and has an intellectual career. There's another man named Uriel da Costa who challenges rabbinic authority and ultimately is forced to recant. He actually has to lie down and allow the congregation to walk over him on their way to synagogue to show his abasement and his regret for all the terrible things that he said and wrote.
What's his name?
Uriel da Costa. U-R-I-E-L da and then C-O-S-T-A. So there are other examples of this Sephardic heresy coming out, but Spinoza is the most prominent example. I gave you the text of his excommunication, which is actually one of the more harsh excommunication texts you'll find in this period. It is very, very strong, and you get the sense that it's sort of a community that's trying to reassert its authority against a population that's less accepting of its direction. He's cursed in 17 different ways, but it doesn't say exactly what he did that was so bad. For that, you have to read his own work and the work of others around him. Spinoza was born in 1632, and he didn't really start his radical intellectual career until after his father died. He was around 20. So you get the sense that he didn't want to upset the apple cart too much. But once it was just him, he decided he wanted to say what he thought, and he lived only for 45 years, from 1632 to 1677. He died most likely because of inhalation of glass dust. He was a lens grinder in an era before OSHA, that you had to wear masks and so on. And he insisted on having an independent life as a lens grinder. After his initial works were published, he was actually offered a position as a professor at the university. But he was concerned it would infringe on his freedom of thought, that he would have to negotiate with the faculty committee and the administration, and he was an employee of the state, and so he kept his lens grinding business so that he could write as freely as possible. And free independent thought was a core principle of his ideology. Now, his excommunication took place in 1656, so he was 24 years old. He's often referred to in European writing as Benedict Spinoza, which is the Latin name for Baruch, means blessed, but he actually never converted. He is most likely the first secular citizen anywhere who was not part of either religious community, but was a resident of the city of Amsterdam and had rights simply as a resident of the city of Amsterdam. Now, his ideology, his philosophy that was problematic from the rabbinic perspective, I'll just highlight 4 principles. There's a lot more than this, but this is relevant for today. The first was, he was a pantheist, which means he didn't necessarily believe in an independent God as a personality saying, let there be, and for him, God was the natural world. And so it doesn't make any sense to pray to the trees or to praise the wind. It's all God. You can learn about God by studying the natural world. That's philosophy, right? You can study the natural world and see God and learn the rules of nature. That's God's rules. But God doesn't reveal a text. God doesn't tell you what to wear or what to eat or what not to eat. Now, Spinoza also believed, the second principle, in free individual inquiry, that the individual rational mind could decide what is true for you. And he makes a very compelling point. He says, you can tell someone what to say, but you can't make someone think anything. I can't make you think that 2 + 2 is 5. Contra George Orwell. I can't make you think anything. I can make you say something. I can compel you on pain of death or torture or excommunication to say something, but I can't make you think anything. And so what Spinoza would argue is that a political system that tries to compel people to believe certain things is not only misguided, it's dangerous. It's misguided because you can't make someone think something. You can make them say it, but they can't think it. And now what you're doing is rewarding the people who lie, who are willing to say what you want them to say, but may not believe what you want them to think, because you can't make them think anything unless you convince them of it using reason. So he was in favor of not only free individual thought, but freedom of speech. It's one of the foundations of the modern liberal democracy that we enjoy. Another principle of Spinoza was that religion was in that realm of convincing people by argument, but not by compelling from force. This is the beginning of the disestablishment of religion. The idea that religion and state should be separate categories. And in fact, for Spinoza, religion needed to be subordinate to the laws of the state. The goal of religion, from Spinoza's perspective, was to teach ethics and moral behavior. Helps you be a good person. Number 1 rule is obey the laws of the state. But it can inculcate ethics, that's fine. But if it undermines law and order, and if you have religious warfare, as he had seen in his era, that's undermining law and order in a stable state, and therefore religion has to be subordinate to the laws of the state. And here's where he rejected Judaism. Because he said the Jews had a law. The law applied when they had a state. Religions don't have law. They're about beliefs and morals. If you want law, you need a state. The Jews have no state. Therefore, the Jews should have no binding laws. Now, if that doesn't undermine Jewish identity enough, Spinoza, his conception of Judaism was as a system of laws. And so there's an open question over whether Spinoza would have considered himself Jewish, because he didn't accept the law. And if for him Judaism was the law, and there's no binding law on me, then he might not have considered himself Jewish in any way that we would recognize. He might have said I'm of Jewish origin, or I transcended my Judaism. But claiming him as the first secular Jew is problematic because he might not have called himself a Jew. First secular citizen, sure. Painting the way? Absolutely. Personal story? Inspirational. As a secular Jew? Questionable.
According to the law, wasn't he a Jew?
But he was excommunicated. So he was a persona non grata. You were not allowed to talk to him, to read his writings, and do any business with him. He was like a shunned person, if you think of that in other cultures.
He was a shunned Jew.
Right. That's right.
And all he did after being shunned was to go on to invent the modern world, or to contribute, importantly, to inventing the modern world.
That's right. So we love to claim him.
Yeah. By the way, I am the proud owner of a T-shirt that says Spinozist.
Yes. Actually, in the Middle Age, in the Enlightenment after Spinoza, to be called a Spinozist was a synonym for being an atheist. Because they didn't get the subtlety of the pantheism thing. They said if there's no personal God, there's no God. If there's no revelation, there's no God. And the last point that Spinoza brought that's relevant to us is that he was one of the first people in European thought to explicitly criticize who wrote the Bible and say it doesn't make sense to me that Moses wrote the whole thing. First of all, he doesn't believe in a divine revelation, right? It doesn't make sense with nature. You want to know God, what God wants, study nature, that's it. But he also said that the Mosaic authorship doesn't make sense. I mentioned the examples last night of Moses saying that he's the humblest man who ever lived. The humblest man who ever lived doesn't say he's the humblest man who ever lived. Secondly, describes what happens after Moses' death. Many passages are written as if they were written centuries later. Moses was the greatest prophet ever. There was never been a prophet like Moses. Like last week since he died? I mean, how long are you talking? Or it says, and so is named like this to this day. Again, it's written from a much later perspective. So Spinoza speculated that the Torah was not written by Moses, it must have been written by someone else or other people, and that, again, was cause to kick him out. In the end, Spinoza had more of an impact on European society than Jewish society, and so that's why I often would term him, and in our anthology, Judaism in a Secular Age, he's described as the precursor. He's someone that came before, an earlier example, but there was no school of Jewish Spinozists that followed on. Later generations of Jews might have turned to his work in Latin, in European translation, just like they read Locke and Hobbes and other thinkers. He was one of those. The Jewish connection for them was not the core part of their relation to Spinoza.
Moses Mendelssohn took a lot of his philosophical and religious arguments for the freedom of Jews from Spinoza. What you just described about Judaism as the laws of the ancient state of Israel was a big part of what Mendelssohn...
That's right. Mendelssohn's book, Jerusalem, is an argument for Jewish toleration written during the Enlightenment. We'll talk about Mendelssohn a little bit in the next session. And he absolutely drew on Spinoza, whether or not he cited him. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. But again, it wasn't sort of an organic transmission. It was reading it as a later episode and then drawing on it. Yes?
So at that time, I'm not as much of a Spinoza scholar as Mother. So at the time that he was writing...
I'm just a fan.
Just an enthusiast. So at the time that he was writing, who was reading his work and being influenced by it?
It was written in Latin, and it was circulating in the intellectual circles of pre-Enlightenment and early Enlightenment Europe. So it could be read in France, it could be read in Germany, it could be read in Amsterdam, in the universities, or so-called men of letters who were simply intellectuals who were furthering philosophy.
Like Thomas Jefferson.
Well, eventually, yes.
From what if I recall from reading, I won't say it was a book club, but there were discussion groups, ecumenical ones.
Yes, they're called the salons, where often women actually would host these events, where they would invite several intellectuals together to have stimulating conversation, and there'd be newspaper reporters who would report in the paper the next day what was said at so-and-so's salon. It wasn't really gossip, it was almost furthering the intellectual conversation, and that was another setting for this.
And I remember reading a piece in New York Review of Books, some guy writing a book about Leibniz meeting Spinoza, that there was a period in time where they may have actually talked to
some interaction with each other.
Yeah. Who was with who?
Leibniz, who helped invent the calculus and other things. So, looking back on this period, and then we'll take a short break and come back. Looking back on this period, what are some of the roots that we can find from the Epicurus, Hellenistic Judaism period, from medieval Jewish experience, and from Spinoza?